Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending where you are in the world. My name is Ben Knight. I'm the Director for Language Research at Cambridge University Press. And I'm going to be talking to you today together with Dan Vincent, who's an experienced teacher in Spain of primary and secondary school students. And by popular request, we've been asked to talk about collaboration and how we can integrate the development of collaboration skills within the ELT classroom when teaching English. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk a little bit about what collaboration skills really means, and then we're going to look at examples of how those can be integrated into the classroom. There's a chat function where you can add any questions you've got, and we'll try to answer as many of those as we can at the end. Okay, so what is collaboration? First of all, why is collaboration becoming such a hot topic? Why are people asking for collaboration skills to be integrated into our English language courses and lessons? Well, it's really to do with the changing nature of work. Work these days has become so complicated that it's impossible for individuals to complete tasks or achieve goals on their own. They need to work collaboratively with other people who have different sets of skills. This is particularly important. We're seeing this in workplaces which have ambitions to work in global economy, and they need people from different backgrounds to be working together. And working in teams is just so much more effective. If anybody watched the fantastic match between Japan and Ireland in the Rugby World Cup last week, they'll have seen Japan with less experienced players beating the world leaders, Ireland, just through their teamwork and better collaboration. It was a masterclass in teamwork and how to work together. And this is why employers have been saying around the world, when they are asked what are the top skills that they want from their employees or their new recruits, collaboration is always near the top. And even for myself, we're recruiting somebody at the moment, and when we look at what are the things that we're looking for from new recruits, being able to collaborate well is at the top of the list. So we can see it's important for the workplace. And many ministries of education have identified this as being an essential skill that the education system has to develop among their students. And this is why you're seeing it increasingly in national curricula. And then that's being passed on to the teachers of different subjects. How can you, if you're teaching maths or sciences or English, how can you help to develop collaboration skills amongst your students? And that's quite difficult for teachers. And there's a number of reasons why it's difficult. First of all, understanding what is meant by collaboration. And then secondly, thinking how that can be integrated into the teaching of English without taking time away from learning the language. So at the top level, the definition is the one you can see on the screen. Collaboration is where people work together to complete a task or achieve a goal. And what you can see from there are three important points. First of all, that you need two or more people to be working together. You need to have a shared task or a goal. And then they need to actually be working together on achieving that task or achieving that goal. So that might sound fairly obvious, but it's worth bearing that in mind when we think about what is a collaborative task. Right, just trying to get on to the next slide. So then what we've done is done quite a lot of research into what makes effective collaboration. And here we've identified the different skills which are needed to be an effective collaborator. And we've put them together into 6 main groups. The first one is that each person who is working on that collaboration needs to take responsibility for their own contribution to the task. They need to know what they're doing, they need to be positive in their contribution, and they need to feel responsible for doing it well. The second set of skills that are needed for good collaboration is being able to manage the sharing of tasks. And this includes both identifying what the different component tasks are, and then being able to allocate those to different people within the group, and then being able to check that that is working, that sharing of tasks is working. The third area, which is really important for collaboration, is being able to listen respectfully and openly. And this is often where collaboration breaks down, is that people are not really listening carefully and openly to what others are saying. The fourth area, which links to that, is the way that you respond to others in a constructive way. So obviously, if you're listening openly and you're trying to encourage collaboration, you need to respond constructively. The fifth area is managing conflict. And conflict, of course, doesn't need to mean violence or anything dramatic, but it is a difference of opinion, which is becoming an obstacle to completing the task. And of course, the first step of that is to be able to identify that there is conflict, that there is a difference of opinion, and then being able to work out how to manage that, how to resolve that difference of opinion. And that relates to the sixth area of skill, which is to negotiate. And negotiating skills are quite complicated, but essentially it's about understanding the goals of different people in the group, what they're trying to achieve and what their assumptions are, and being able to try and come to a common result that everybody is satisfied with. So those are the underlying skills which are needed to be a good collaborator, to be good at collaborating. Now, how can you help to develop those skills in the classroom? Well, there are two things you need first in order to be able to help your students. First of all, you need to understand the component skills, which I was just describing. You need to understand what they are so that you can then make decisions about what you're going to focus on in a particular lesson or activity. So it might be that you decide in this activity, you're going to focus on how you manage the sharing of tasks in a group. And you might be teaching them the language for that and practicing doing that. The second thing that you need to be able to help your students is to understand what they can learn at each stage of their learning journey in relation to those skills. And that might sound a little complicated, but it does depend. If you're at primary level, collaboration can look very different to when you're at university level. And so one of the things we've been doing at Cambridge is trying to understand exactly that, what all the different skills are and how they develop throughout that learning journey. And so I'm going to step back a little bit now and look at the whole framework, the whole approach to life skills and 21st century skills, so that you can understand this a bit better. So at the moment, we're looking at 5 stages of the learning journey. So people are learning, they learn at pre-primary or kindergarten, at primary, secondary, higher education, and at work. And the development of these skills looks different at each of those stages. Then what we've done at Cambridge is to create this framework which shows how the different life skills or competencies fit together so that you can understand how does collaboration differ from communication, for example. So we've got these 6 main areas, 6 main life competencies: creative thinking, critical thinking, learning to learn, communication, collaboration, and social responsibilities. And then underpinning those are 3 important areas: emotional development, digital literacy, and discipline knowledge, which really integrate with all of those life competencies. So that's giving you an overall picture of life skills. We then break down each of those into their component skills. And here you can see we've done that for each of the 6 areas. And you can see for collaboration, we have 4 core areas within collaboration. Taking personal responsibility for own contributions to a group task, which I mentioned at the beginning. Listening respectfully and responding constructively to others' contributions. This is what I mentioned earlier, but it's combined 2 of them into one. Managing the sharing of tasks and working towards a resolution for a task, which again is putting together 2 things I'd mentioned earlier: managing conflict and negotiation. So that's the broad picture. And I just want to say one quick word about the word competencies, because sometimes I say skills and sometimes competencies. And what's the difference? Well, competencies is really the correct term. Competencies has three components. It has knowledge. What do you need to know in order to do something well? Skill, which is the ability to do it well and fluently. And that's really, skill is what you get as a result of practice. The more you practice something, the more skill you have. And then attitude is the way of thinking which is needed to do something well. And a competency, when someone has competency, it's that combination of having the knowledge they need, the skill in doing it fluently and subconsciously, and attitude is what they need to really make it work. And that's what we're aiming for when we talk about competencies. So what we have is a framework at Cambridge which combines the different types of competency, creative thinking, social responsibilities, etc., and breaks those down, and then looks at how they develop from pre-primary to at work. And the way that we manage that, the way that we capture how each of those competencies develops along the learning journey is by using can-do statements. Oops. Now, can-do statements describe what someone can do with each of those skills at each stage. So let's take an example. Within collaboration, one of those core areas was listening respectfully and responding constructively to others' contributions. Now, what does that look like for pre-primary? Well, I've got a couple of example can-do statements. First one, allows others to finish speaking before sharing own ideas. And then second one is extends and elaborates play ideas, for example, building up a role play with other children. These are things which demonstrate collaboration skills at pre-primary stage. So this is, if you're a pre-primary teacher, you might be thinking, this is the kind of thing I want to be able to develop among my students. If we look at primary, how does that same competency, that same area of competency develop? Well, we can see these can-do statements focuses on the content of group talk from start to finish. So they don't lose focus on what the group is talking about. They learn how to interrupt others politely, and they learn how to respond positively to what others say about the group task they are doing. If we look at secondary, we see acknowledges and agrees with others' ideas. We also want them to learn to give their opinion on other students' contributions respectfully. And a third can-do is helping students to build on other students' contributions by adding examples or further related ideas. If you're working at high school level, at higher education level, at university, a can-do statement could be responds in an open-minded way to different ideas, including those which represent an opposing point of view, or acknowledges other points of view before presenting a counter-argument. And then if you are teaching people at work, can-do statements might be more related to work type of contexts, interrupting people in meetings or acknowledging contributions of others in a meeting. So what you can see, let me just go back a little bit. What you can see here is that from the framework, we're able to identify what are the different component skills to developing collaborative competency. And we can also use the can-dos to think about what we want students at our particular level to be able to do by the end of their teaching, by the end of their course. Now, how can we integrate these into English language teaching? As I said at the beginning, a lot of ministries now are expecting teachers to integrate this into the teaching of their subject. And that's what we're going to look at now, and Dan is going to look at that. I'm just going to talk about three high-level approaches to that. First of all, that as teachers, you need to be looking for opportunities to focus on those specific skills in shared activities. You could also be practicing the language needed to use those skills. And the third approach is to reflect on those skills before and after doing an activity which requires collaboration. So those are three general approaches. But for real good examples, I'm going to hand over to Dan now. Just let us switch over control. I'm in Cambridge, but Dan is in Madrid. So we're just going to do a little bit of coordination, collaboration.
Okay, thank you, Ben. I'd just like to say I'm going to talk you through some practical ideas, and if anyone has any questions, either for Ben or for me or for both of us, we'll try our best to answer those at the end of the session. Okay, so I'm just going to give you an outline first of what I'm going to talk about in this second half of the webinar. We're going to look at, let me just this to work. Pair work and collaboration. Some simple ideas for making pair work more collaborative and bringing out some of the skills that Ben, some of the competencies that Ben talked about. And then project work and collaboration. I'm sure many of you do project work with your students. Some of you may do it quite frequently, and it's a great way to develop students' collaborative competencies. So we're going to look at some examples of that, focusing on the process, the collaborative process of the project, and then the language needed to develop those collaborative skills. And we're going to look at 4 examples. One is building robots. Not real robots, so don't get too excited. Co-creating stories, designing infographics, and then creating questionnaires and presenting results. And I'll talk you through those. And then I'd like to talk a little bit at the end about self-assessment and reflection, which was one of the things Ben mentioned towards the end there. Okay, so I'm sure many of you are familiar with pair work, and you do pair work with your students quite frequently. You have them talk together, chat together, practice a language point together, discuss something together. And pair work can very easily be made more collaborative. So I'm just going to give you an example of what I mean. Here's a typical discussion question from this is one that I've done with my secondary students and also with adults, where we're talking about education. And the question is, how useful are these subjects? Discuss with a partner. Now, it's an open-ended question. It's not a yes-no question. They're not asked, are these subjects useful or not? They're asked, how useful are they? So they have to, that opens up the discussion. But as it stands, it's not particularly collaborative. They can simply take turns to say their opinion. However, if you simply add a very simple task, so here, the task is decide together which are the 5 most useful subjects and place them in order of importance. Make sure you justify your ideas to one another. The task immediately becomes more collaborative, and they have to do something together. Ben talked at the beginning of a shared task or a shared goal. The goal here is to come up with a list that they both agree on. And in a very quick and easy way, a discussion activity is turned into a collaborative activity. This is one idea that you can use for pair work. Another one that some of you may have tried in class is to order the sentences in a dialogue. So here, for example, is one that I've done with various classes. I've simplified it for this webinar. Work with a partner, put these sentences in order to make a conversation at the Tourist Information Centre. Here are the sentences out of order. Now, as it stands, the students could do that task together and it would be collaborative, but they may not necessarily use collaborative language to put those sentences into the right order. So I'm going to just show you this would be the correct dialogue that they come up with. In order to make this more collaborative and to really develop the collaborative skills that we are trying to encourage with our students, you also need to give them, as Ben mentioned, the language to do that. So here is some process language. By process language, I'm going to be referring to the process of collaboration and developing those skills. So this is some very simple language for them to do the ordering task. I think this one is first, next, last. Where do you think this goes? Where should we put this one? What about this one? Let's put this one here for now. That doesn't seem right. And are you sure? So you have two sets of language. You've got the target language of the class, which in this case would be something to do with asking for information at a tourist office, and then also the language that you want to input to allow them to develop the collaborative skills and to actually do the collaboration in English. This process language can be inputted and practiced at an early stage in the course and then recycled and reused whenever you want to do this kind of activity. But if you want students to, you really want them to be collaborating, you want to focus on the language as well that they need. And we're going to look at some more examples of that as I go through the projects. Collaboration in itself, Ben talked about the rugby game the other day, but collaboration can be everything from organising the Olympic Games to organising a picnic with friends in a park. And it calls on all kinds of sub-skills, which you will be familiar with probably from your personal lives and your working lives. So for example, there's brainstorming, sharing ideas, coming up with ideas, negotiation, deciding which ideas to proceed with, deciding who does what, decision making. At all stages of a project or a collaborative project, decisions need to be made, and they need to be made collectively in many cases. And then there's planning, organizing, and also doing whatever it is you set yourself to do. Planning the picnic, for example, organizing the picnic, who's going to bring the food, who's going to bring the drink, who's going to invite people, where should it be, etc. And then a very important one that is useful, I think we'll all agree, throughout life is scheduling and timekeeping. In real life, in working life, in higher education, in our personal lives, things are normally done to time limits and to a deadline. And that's a key skill that we can begin to help our students develop through collaborative work in class. So project work in class is an ideal way to focus on developing skills. And I'd just like to make the point that the English language classroom is really an excellent, pardon me, an excellent venue for developing the skills that Ben and I are talking about, because all of these, brainstorming, negotiation, decision-making, planning, organizing, scheduling, timekeeping, they all require people to communicate. So it's an ideal place to practice language and develop skills one and the same time. We're going to look at some projects now that I hope will give you a clear idea of what I mean. The first one, giving feedback. Sorry, there was one more skill that's quite useful throughout a project and after a project, and we'll look at a little bit about that later. The first project is one that I've done with my primary students quite frequently, and it's building robots. The students were about 8 or 9 years old, and the project was we had been studying about robots and reading about robots, and the project was for them to build a robot. I only have pictures of these 2 robots because the others the children took home. The robots they were made from stationery, and they had to include a special function. The one on the left, I seem to remember it had a kind of X-ray vision. I'm not really sure what the orange one was. Generally with children, they come up with homework robots that will do their homework for them or clean their room. There was a vegetable eating robot as well that would eat the vegetables so that the children didn't have to do it. So this is very simple. I put the students into groups, usually 3, 4, occasionally 2, depending on the numbers of students. They have a pile of stationery, and the project is to construct the robot. Now, the reason I'm focusing on this project first is I'd like you to take note of the fact that, first of all, the students have a model. The model in this case would be a robot that I made or some pictures of robots, so they have an idea of what they need to build. But also because the product, the output of the project, isn't language-based. There's no English in these robots. There's no English written on them. They don't speak, for example. So the entire focus in terms of language and skills development is on the collaborative process of deciding how to build the robot and then building the robot. Quite often when we do projects, we think a lot about the product. So we ask students to write a story. We focus on the language for writing stories, or create a poster. We focus on the language necessary of the poster. But really to bring the the focus back to developing collaborative skills, we need to look at the process as well, and not only the product. So Ben mentioned earlier that perhaps you would focus on one particular competency or one particular area at a time. And in this case, I focused on brainstorming. So before the children could begin to build their robots, they had to talk together about how they were going to build it and try and come up with some ideas. And the skill that I wanted to focus on was for them to brainstorm. And here is some language that I inputted. It's very simple, straightforward language, very familiar language for brainstorming ideas. I know, why don't we use the toilet rolls? How about making a robot that eats your vegetables? I've got a good idea. I think blue card would be better because it's more beautiful. That's a good idea, but I've got a better idea. So we inputted this language. I did a demonstration at the front of the class where we shared ideas for a robot that I would build. So we practiced that, but this gives the children the language they need to be able to collaborate in terms of sharing ideas. Then another area where we focused is on very simple, making the robot. So here you want them to be deciding things together as they go, sharing ideas as they go, giving feedback to one another as they go, responding to one another as they go. And this again can be really, really simple. This is not cognitively challenging or linguistically challenging language for primary children. First, next, then, simple imperatives, put, cut, stick, fold. Some language for sharing the roles. Let me make the face. Why don't you decorate the head? We have to finish the legs. That looks good, etc. So the language that you can input for to help them actually develop those skills, it can be very, very straightforward. It can be very, very useful, and it can be adapted very easily, I think, to the linguistic and cognitive level of the students, or made more complicated depending on the class and the age of the students. So that's one very simple one. Someone mentioned, we had a question earlier about weaker students and stronger students. I'll try to answer that now. One, when children are doing projects together, it's very good if each of them either has a role. So in this case, I would have encouraged children to decide to build different parts of the robot together at some stage, or you can pair weaker and stronger students together to encourage the stronger ones to help the weaker ones, and also to help the weaker ones feel that they have some support. And deciding roles, deciding who does what in itself is quite a key collaborative skill, and it's part of the framework that we looked at earlier. Another one I'd like to show you about with primary is co-writing stories. We were studying fairy stories from around the world, and then the children did a project where they had to come up with their own fairy story. So I gave them, put children into groups of 2, 3, again 4 students, and gave them a large set of pictures. This is a smaller selection that you can see on the screen, including a photo of me when I was younger. That's the photo, not the wizard. And the children, before they could even start to write, they had to decide together which pictures they were going to use in their story. So which elements they were going to include in their story. We had essentially groups of 3 students, but I told them they had to decide 10 pictures. That was in order for them not to just take 3 each and then not have any discussion. By asking them to take 10, that necessitated some discussion over which the 10th picture should be. And it was quite interesting to watch the groups of children. Some of them took turns. They all chose together the first one, then the second one together, then the third one together. Others took 3 each, and then they decided on the 10th one together. But again, it was very important to input the language for them to be able to do that choosing and decision-making process. So here's some of the language we inputted for that. How about for example, how about the frog? I like this one because, let's use this one. This one is better because we need 1 more, we need 2 more. That's a good idea. So again, very simple language input, but the language that allows them to do this, develop this particular skill, which I've called choosing here, but is essentially decision making. Just to give you a quick idea of the kind of stories they came up with, they were supposed to make a poster using the pictures, but these 2 boys drew a picture of what appears to be the Hulk punching me, and then a very strange story, which I'll just show you. Once upon a time, I'll let you read that because my screen is slightly obscured. The story itself was, I'm not going to write to Netflix and ask them to to take this as an idea for a new series, but this project did have a language output, which was the story. But again, as you can see, there was the language output in the product, but also the process language of the decision making. Okay, it was a very silly story in which I was turned into a sheep and then sadly killed. I tended to die in most of the stories the children came up with. Okay, so those are two collaborative projects you can do with primary age, and I'm sure you could expand them as well to secondary as well, or even with adults. But we're going to look now at two projects that I have done with secondary age students. I'm sure many of you will have made posters. Some of you may have made infographics. If you're not sure what an infographic is, it's a visual way of presenting numerical or often complex information. And I did a project about sports that were not yet Olympic sports, and the students were asked to research a sport which is an established sport but has not yet been accepted as an Olympic sport, and to prepare a poster or infographic. This is the sport. I'm not sure if anyone recognizes it. It's not only frisbee, it's ultimate frisbee, which is frisbee in teams, which is a well-established sport, but is not yet an Olympic sport and is trying to be. So they had a model. This was the model. It's not exactly an infographic because there's I didn't expect them to be able to design an infographic using software, for example, but it does include some of the features of different text sizes, some icons, visual information, numbers instead of figures to help the reader assimilate that information quite clearly. This could have been a straightforward project without too much focus on collaboration if I had just given it to students and told them, find a sport that's not yet an Olympic sport, go away and make something like this. But to ensure that they had to collaborate together, again, these students were put into groups of 3 and they were asked to divide up the sections between them. So one of them would do some research into the history of the sport. One of them would find out about the rules. Another one would find out about the main tournaments, etc. They would go away, or they went away. They did their individual research, and then they came back and they shared their findings, and then together they created the poster infographic. So I built into that a stage where they had to make a decision who was going to do what, and then they all had to take responsibility for their contribution. They couldn't not do what they'd been set to do, otherwise the project would be incomplete and they wouldn't be able to share anything with their partners. So this was to encourage them to decide together what they were going to do, and then to encourage them to take responsibility for their part. I actually set the research part as homework, so they had the extra responsibility of going home and making sure they came back with some information to share. And then we decided together as a class which sport should be next in the Olympics. So that's another idea of how you can build in a stage which is more collaborative, either decision making or assigning roles, etc. A slightly more complicated project that I've done with higher level students is for them to develop a questionnaire and then to present their results. In this one, it was a questionnaire that they did with their classmates about clothes shops in their town. So clothes shops in Madrid, which were the popular ones, which were the cheapest ones, which were the most fashionable ones, and so on. And they were going to get everybody's opinion and then put that information into graphs and then share the information. They had 3 invented shops: Fleet Street, Stitch and Parker. Some graphs, again, as models, so they can see what they need to come up with. This is what they will be producing, but this is not where the collaboration took place. The collaboration took place in another stage, which I'll show you now. They had a list of questions, and they had to decide which of those questions in their group they wanted to ask, and then also add a question. So they didn't have to make a questionnaire with all 8 of the questions, but they had to select those questions. Having done that, they then divided up who was going to ask which question, and then they would then go and interview their partners. So again, they was taking responsibility for their contribution. A stage of negotiating which questions they wanted in their questionnaire, then deciding who was going to ask what, and then going away, doing something individually, so taking responsibility for their role, and then coming back and sharing what they found out in order to produce the graphs. So just to recap that, this is what the students had to do. They had to decide which questions they want to ask, decide who is going to ask which ones, conduct the questionnaire, compile the results, and then eventually present their results. Quite often in collaborative projects, you want students to, you need to make it very clear to them that they're practicing, or the project is intended to help them develop certain collaborative skills. So, for example, if you are practicing decision making, or you're practicing the language for sharing ideas or giving feedback, it's really important, I think, to make it clear to students that that's what you're doing. And then in the presentation stage, whether it be sharing the story, the fairy story that they wrote, or presenting their robot to children at the beginning of the class, showing everyone else the infographic, or presenting their findings from the questionnaire, I also encourage students to say how well they collaborated together. So did they share their ideas fairly? Was it easy to decide things together? Was it difficult? Did they use the input language for brainstorming? Did they use the language for dividing up roles, etc.? So they know that at the end, they will need to comment to the class and to the teacher on that aspect as well. So that they know from the beginning. I think we can't expect students to know that they're developing those skills unless we point out that that is actually a key feature of what we're trying to do. And I think they respond much better when you say to a student, today we're going to do a project and we're going to practice, let's say, for example, timekeeping. We're going to see how well you can stick to your time and so on. And when students know that that is part of the focus of what you're doing, they're more likely to pay attention to it and then to, I think, develop it. Throughout that, we've looked at process language. I'd just like to give you some more examples. There was the brainstorming language we looked at the beginning. There's also assigning roles, deciding who is going to do what. Here's some simple language you can use to help students do that. We need one person, or we need 2 people to do X. Who wants to do X? Lucas, why don't you? Fernanda should do such and such because she's good at such and such. Omar and Kelly could share so deciding roles, deciding who is going to do what, and some process language to enable them to do that. Decision making, groups making decisions together, and then voting if they're feeling particularly democratic, or deciding in other ways. There's some language there for decision making. Does anyone else want to contribute? Okay, shall we vote, etc.? I can't see my screen completely clearly. Timekeeping, a key skill. It's a key skill. Here's some language that you can use to help students check that they're on time and they're on task. How much time do you think do we have to do the first part, or to write the questions? How much time do we have to do the research? How long will it take? I think we'll need 20 minutes. We've only got 30 minutes left. We need to hurry. We're running out of time. Come on and get a move on. While we're on timekeeping, I'd just like to point out that sometimes you have a student who is perhaps quieter or shyer, or they don't, they're not as willing to collaborate as actively as some of the others in the group. When you have a student like that, you can give them the timekeeping role. So they're in charge of making sure everyone else is on track. You can also give it to particularly bossy students as well. So they're still involved and they still have an important role to play, and they're still developing key skills, and they're still contributing very much to a team effort. But they can maybe be slightly outside of the core team, as it were. And then giving feedback. It's always good to get students to feedback to each other on their project, and also during a project, letting each other know how they feel about its progress. And it should be very positive. The language that you input here should encourage them to be positive and encourage them to be constructive. So I really like the way you built the base of the robot. I really like the way you presented your graph, for example. So they're primed to say something positive. Equally, I was impressed by such and such was good, but I think you could improve by. So again, positive feedback, but also constructive. And then why don't you try such and such next time? So again, the language itself encourages them there to be constructive and positive. Okay. Finally, we're going to move on to self-reflection and assessment. It's really important in all kinds of activities, but particularly when you're developing these kind of key competencies. Apart from, as well as making students aware that that is part of what you're focusing on, you really want to encourage students to think about how well they're doing or where they need to focus in future. They're not going to become wonderful timekeepers during one lesson or during one project. They're not going to necessarily become better at sharing tasks or listening constructively and responding constructively in one project. But hopefully throughout the learning journey or throughout a course, if you focus a number of times on a particular skill, they will become better. And self-reflection and assessment can be done at primary and at secondary and adult level. I'm just going to give you a couple of ideas here for how that can be done. With primary, it's best to make it as kind of visual and graphic as possible. So a very simple, if I can find it, graphic would be like, this is for how much English they speak. So this is not particularly tied to collaboration, but it's one way you can get the children to focus on how much English they've been using. So they look through the smileys and they choose one of the boxes. They tick it or they color it in. It's very important, by the way, if you have this kind of, well, I'll come to that later. Anyway, 4 smileys here that they choose. The one on the right is looking quite sad and lonely because he hasn't spoken any English at all. Hopefully you need to encourage and develop this over time. Students tend to put lots and lots and lots and lots and lots at first, but then they become more objective once you say, well, is that true? You were very quiet, you didn't use that language, or you can help students become a little bit more cognizant of how they've actually done. In terms of collaboration, you can ask the group to think together about how they've done. So in primary, here's a very simple idea that I've used where the children together in their group, they answer this question: how well did we do the project together? So they decide if they did it very well, the faces are all happy and together. Well, they're still happy, but not quite as together. Okay, no smiles there, but they're still on the table together. And then if they really haven't worked very well together, we can do better next time. So the sad faces are very much a part there. So again, you can encourage them to think together, and that again is a collaborative activity about how they did. With secondary and higher, you can make it more language input. So here's an idea that you can use. For the infographic, this is for where they prepared the infographic about the Olympic sport. Discuss these questions in your group and decide together between 1 and 6. How well did we research and plan the infographic together? 1, not very well. 6, very well. And then another question, how easy to understand was our infographic? 1, not very easy. 6, very easy. So again, they have to collaborate to come up with this score. And then a couple of individual questions they can answer. How well did I contribute to the project? 1, not very much. 6, a lot. And how much English did I use to do the project? 1, not very much. 6, a lot. This really needs to be done repeatedly for them to get used to it. Students tend to put very well, a lot, very easy, fantastic at the beginning. But with time, my experience is that they do become more objective about their own performance. And then you need to make very clear that this is not a formal mark. They're not going to be penalized in any way. This is purely to help them reflect on how they've done in terms of the skills that you've been trying to develop. And you can refer to their self-assessment from a previous project when you do the next project. So for example, if a particular student in one project for how well did I contribute has put 2, you can refer them in the next project. Okay, let's try to get a higher score this time to encourage them to contribute and collaborate more. Just a quick point with self-assessment, you would have seen, I'll just go back to the primary smileys, that there are 4, and then here there are also 4, and here there are 6. 6 options. It's always better to have an even number, so not 3 but 4, not 5 but 6. And the reason for that is if you have a 1, 2, 3, people tend to choose the middle option because it's safe and they don't really have to think very hard. Children, teenagers, adults don't have to think very hard about their answer. They go for the one in the middle. Whereas with an even number, you're forced to think and be a bit more honest, I think. Okay, so hopefully those will give you some ideas of how you can bring an element of collaboration into class and help students develop those skills. That's the end of my part. We've got some time for questions. If no, I won't put that. If anyone has any questions for either for me or for Ben.
Well, we have Dan. Thanks very much, Dan. That was really interesting. I really enjoyed that, and I loved those robots. I was just looking through the questions that are coming through on the chat line. Maybe we can pick up some of those to begin with. There was a question which you addressed to some extent, which was around grouping students on collaborative, whether you should put strong and weak ones together. Was there anything more you want to say? Does it make more sense to have students at the same level together or different levels?
I think that depends very much on classroom dynamics. Which students work well together can often maybe be a more deciding factor than whether they're weak or strong. What I would say is that be very careful to not make groups too big. So if you think that, for example, in the infographic, there were really 3 areas to research. So it wouldn't have made sense to make groups of 4, because then one of them will have nothing to do. So you always need to think, how many roles are there in this project? How many people does it take to do it? So that you ensure that everyone has something to do. It could be that the example is a group of 6 and then they divide into 3 pairs. But I think one way is to encourage people to have something to do. Whether you feel they need to then work with someone or not is another factor. But don't create groups that don't make sense for the number of roles in the project.
Yeah, I agree completely. And I think from my own experience, I find that it's good to take both approaches, that sometimes to be mixing strong and weak, but not always to do it. If it gets too routine to do that, sometimes that's not very, doesn't feel very good for the stronger students. So I would mix the approaches, yeah. There was another question about linguistically challenging versus cognitively challenging. And actually, it's quite straightforward, that difference. Linguistically challenging is the difficulty of the language being used from like a CFR point of view. A1 is elementary language, so how difficult is the vocabulary and the grammar? Cognitively challenging means that the task itself. So some children, are too young to really empathize clearly with other children, to be able to understand and respond constructively to arguments of others. I suppose the way to think of the cognitively challenging one is to think, even if it was in their own first language, are there aspects of the task that they would find difficult? And that's the cognitively challenging bit.
Yeah, I agree. And I think that the input language can be made very, very simple. Even if it's just let's, for example, to make suggestions, just let's is enough. Simple imperatives, for example, so you can target the linguistic level very easily, I think.
Yeah. There's a couple of questions which are sort of similar, and it's about having forming groups, and
Mm.
either one person is really bored and not participating, or one person is really taking the lead so strongly that the others are just becoming quite passive. Did you have any views on that?
That kind of mimics real life in some ways, I think, when it comes to collaboration. I think, again, a key to that is to make sure that when you plan the project, you plan for there to be something for everyone to do. However, if there's a very bossy student, I think you can try to encourage, accommodate that bossiness, for example, by giving them the timekeeping role. I find also that some of those students, if you give them an extra role, which is to make sure that the others are working or to make sure that they're all using the language you want them to use, that kind of absorbs their energy a little bit. With the weaker students, I think you have to be, as a teacher, sympathetic to the fact that they may not be bored, they may be shy, they may not by nature feel very good about teamwork. But if you encourage them over time and you let them know that they are going to have to talk about their contribution, even if it's just to say, with the robots, for example, I made the face. And it could be with more complicated with the infographic. For example, I went away and researched 3 sports and I decided to do this, and then I persuaded my team that we should talk about that. If they know that part of the presentation stage will involve saying what they did, I think that can encourage them to take more responsibility, and that they know that they can't get away with being lazy.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are really good ideas. I think I would also think about your suggestions for kind of self-assessment, because one of the things I find that people who don't engage, often they don't really see the point. They think they're in a language lesson and they're thinking, why are they doing something which is not about language? And so using those self-assessment things at the beginning so that they are aware of what they're focusing on, and then at the end to actually score themselves, makes them think more clearly. So you can have, for example, in your self-assessment grids, it could be focused on something like taking turns. You know,
yes.
Has everybody had a turn? Was I good at letting people take a turn? Or these kind of things, or focused on the sharing of work. So that just in that lesson, that task, that's all you're focusing on. And it then means that everybody has to think about, are they doing those things which are part of collaboration? We've got lots of questions flying in now, which are great. Are there any ways to measure and assess collaboration in the ELT classroom? There's a tough one.
Well, I think like what you just said, if you're focusing on, for example, turn taking, and then there's a reflection stage where they say whether they did take turns and whether everyone in the group took turns, whether they used that language, and whether the turn taking was useful. Did they just I speak and then the person to my right speaks and the person to their right speaks, or was it actually effective at doing what they wanted to do? Is one way you could measure it, for example.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I've been working with Cambridge Assessment on this topic, and they are looking at how they can measure collaboration. And it's really difficult because you want to give a score to an individual, and yet collaboration always depends on more than one person. But really, I think if for a teacher in informal evaluation, I think it is using those kind of questions that you've got, or things like the can-do statements with a score of how well you've done it. And as a teacher, you can do that. You can look at your students and say, at a score of 6, how well they've been sharing out the tasks or participating, etc.
Yeah, I think also, as you said, focusing on a very specific can-do statement, on a specific skill like turn taking or assigning the tasks. So you're not looking at collaboration in its entirety, but one particular area for that particular project. How well did they do that? Because it might be that one of them was very good at taking turns, but the other was great at deciding who does what. But that you need to, if you're focusing on the turn taking, let's look at how everyone did with turn taking. So be very specific with the skill that you're looking at.
Yeah, yeah. There's a question, I mean, some of these questions kind of overlap a little bit. How to encourage shy students to take a role in negotiation? I think some of your points about assigning roles is part of that.
Yeah, I think assigning roles, making sure there's something for everyone to do. None of this means that the teacher isn't there to monitor or to kind of encourage the students. So I mean, I think if I noticed a group, primary or secondary, where one of the students looked like they were shy and maybe not taking part, you could approach that group and simply say, okay, has everybody made a suggestion? Or without necessarily even indicating that particular student, there's still a role for the teacher in encouraging this collaborative effort. What's important is that the teacher doesn't do the collaboration for them. So they don't dictate who takes turns, they don't assign the roles. But for example, it might be that you say, has everyone got something to do? And then you find that one student hasn't, and you say, well, can you together decide what Pablo has or Pablo does? I think there's still quite an important role for the teacher there.
Yeah, and I think also with some of the language that you were using at the beginning of the task to help them do the task, the kind of task management language, getting people just to practice things like, and what do you think? Kind of just breaks the ice a little bit, makes them realize that that's something they have to do. They have to ask others what they think.
Yeah, usually I do like a demonstration stage. So it would be, for example, with the storytelling, all the students in the front of the class, and then we decide, we together we choose pictures for me to come up with a story, and that's when they get to practice the language. But in many cases, I would give them, either ask them to write that language into their notebooks or give them a printout with the language on, and then they have to tick when they've used that language. And you can make it competitive. The first one to tick it all off has some praise for that, but you can make it quite mechanical. That, okay, let's see how often you can say this phrase, or can you use all of them? So to really ensure they're using it as well.
Yeah. Dan, I think we've run out of time.
Sorry, I couldn't answer
so much. Yeah, no, I think we've covered a lot of them. There's maybe a few more we can try and follow up on. So now we're going to draw to a close. If you want your a recording and the certificate, that'll be sent to you by email now. In the next 2 weeks, you should receive that. And it's been really great to have you as part of this webinar, and it's really been a great example of collaboration as we've had to do this across countries.
Across countries. Yeah, thank you everyone who's attended, and I hope you get to try some of those ideas out in your own classes.